All right, we need to talk about this, uniteapi.dev. I love the website, uniteapi.dev. It gives you tons of information about what's going on inside of Pokemon Unite, and I also think it gives people a bad idea of some of the things that are going on inside of Pokemon Unite. We're going to get into it in this video because I think people do a very poor job of understanding what this is actually telling you and what is good information and what is essentially useless information. And it'll all make sense soon. Oh, also, I'm going to later in this video go through a list of Pokemon provided to me by EvoCron, shout out to Evo, who crunch the numbers and can show you what actually is a good win rate Pokemon based on its pick rate and what actually doesn't really have any relevance inside the game based on its win rate and pick rate and other factors. It's going to be pretty interesting, so stay tuned for that. Stay tuned, everybody. But for now, let me just kind of give you my take on what I think a lot of people are doing. Jake, your resident content cowboy here. Yeehaw. That was a secret yeehaw. Just between me and you. Don't tell anyone. Taking a look at the meta here in Unite API, you get a lot of great information. You see things like Clefable having a massive pick rate up at 20%. You see things like the highest win rate of the week, a Pokemon like Dragapult. Dragapult also having a pretty high pick rate here of 14%. You also see some interesting outliers like Tyranitar with a 51.85% win rate. Let me just briefly say what this is. What you're seeing right here are all of the games played by the top 10,000 players in the world, not split up by region, not split up by solo, duo, trio, 5-stack. These are all the games played by the top 10,000 players in ranked. So you get a lot of great information from this here. You also get a lot of information that is cool and interesting. I love to look at it, but honestly doesn't tell you very much. Let me break it down for you in a couple ways here. First off, let me start off with some really good information. Here is some good information. The highest picked Pokemon in the game currently is Clefable. You're seeing it in 20% of the Pokemon Unite games that you play, which means as a supporter especially, it is the most dominant supporter, at least by pick rate, inside the entire game. And if you scroll down to its win rate, you can see right here that it wins about 50.46% of the time. You can also click on Clefable, the Pokemon, right here, and you can see that the Moonlight Follow Me build happens to have a much higher win rate than Moonlight Gravity. However, Moonlight Gravity is overwhelmingly chosen and Moonlight Follow Me not as much. So less players are playing Moonlight Follow Me. However, when they do play it, they're winning a little bit more often. I think what you're seeing right here is the fact that sometimes Gravity is just not that useful and Follow Me is actually really good. The times when Gravity is not useful, this build really outperforms. You also get some interesting information with this, like what battle item, has the best win rate. Most people are picking X Speed, but it looks like Eject Button has a very, very slight higher win rate. Things like that are really interesting and really good information. When you see a Pokemon like Clefable has a massive pick rate, it is a supporter, and it still has a positive win rate, I think you can get a ton of information from that. Clefable is a very, very solid supporter pick, even with solo queue games where people are picking Clefable. More often than not, this Pokemon is winning and it's being chosen a ton. Great information. Now let me talk to you about some deceptive information. Our 5th highest win rate Pokemon of the week, and the Pokemon right above it, our 4th highest win rate Pokemon, we have Tyranitar and Garchomp. These have pretty solid win rates, over 50%. We could get more into this here in a minute, but essentially if a Pokemon's winning more than losing, that's very positive. Sometimes Pokemon's win rates are absurd, like when we had Zacian at its peak, Mewtwo at its peak. Thank goodness we are not there anymore. Right now we have Tyranitar and Garchomp in these spots. Now, if you just look at this list and you don't consider anything else about it, you would think that they're some of the best Pokemon in the game. And while I think Tyranitar is a little underrated and I think Garchomp is actually pretty solid in the right hands, you don't get good information here. Let me scroll all the way down to their pick rate. Scrolling, still scrolling, looking for them. They're somewhere on here, all the way down at the bottom. Where are they? Ah, yes, here they are. Garchomp has a 4% pick rate, and Tyranitar has a 2.33% pick rate. What does this mean? Well, essentially this means these Pokemon are not really being picked at all, and the few times they are being played, they were probably being played by someone who's very good with these Pokemon, and because of that, they are getting some wins. In another week, you could see these Pokemon with a low win rate because the players who played them that week just weren't very good with them. You don't get good information when a Pokemon has a low pick rate, and that's one of the things I really want to try to hammer home with this video, because I'll have people talk to me when I'm streaming live about Pokemon that are doing really well in the game, but truthfully, if a Pokemon has a low pick rate, it's not really relevant what its win rate is. Like, Serena's a good example. I'm not sure what Serena's pick rate is, I hadn't even looked at it yet, but I assume it's relatively low. 3.52%, and Zarina is sitting at a 51.57% win rate. That's mainly because the people who play Zarina, the few of them who play it, are pretty cracked on this Pokemon. Dodrio is another Pokemon that suffers from this same thing. Very few people play it. The ones who actually sit with it and play it pretty well. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Zarina, Garchomp, Tyranitar, or Dodrio are crushing it inside the game right now. Don't get me wrong, they could be. These Pokemon absolutely could be doing really, really well. But from this information, from the Unite API site, we actually don't have any relevant data saying that they're crushing it inside the game. What we have is a few players who are playing these Pokemon, and when they play them in this particular week, they are doing well with them. Now let me drill it down even further and take a look at Tyranitar right here, a Pokemon with a really low pick rate, and right now it has the build Ancient Power Dark Pulse with a 76% pick rate, meaning almost everyone who's playing Tyranitar, which there are very few of, is playing this build right here, and it wins a majority of the time, 52.62%. Now we have Dark Pulse Sandtomb winning only 47% of the time. Does this mean that Dark Pulse Sandtomb is that much worse than Ancient Power? No, it really doesn't. It's barely being picked on a Pokemon that is barely being picked. Another week, we could see a total shift in this information. Is it possible that we get a little bit of an insight with this Pokemon? Well, what we do know is everyone who does play it plays Dark Pulse Ancient Power, but with such a low pick rate, I don't think you can really take too much from these builds at all. In fact, you can see that Stone Edge Sandtomb, with a really low pick rate, has a relatively high win rate, almost as high as the #1 build, which just really means that the very few times this was chosen, it happened to win, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the viability of this build. Everyone's always talking about what's viable, and here's a good conversation about it. This isn't necessarily an indicator of what is viable on Tyranitar at all. There are also a ton of factors that go into certain builds or certain Pokemon, how often they're picked. For instance, you can see something like Gyarados. Gyarados just got released, so it has a pretty low pick rate. Maybe not a lot of people have picked up Gyarados yet. Then again, maybe a lot of people have picked up Gyarados and they've decided that this Pokemon just isn't powerful enough. You see that all the time. But one thing is for sure, there are more players who would have a starter Pokemon closer to Charizard than you would closer to Gyarados. So you can assume, all right, there's probably more interest, oddly enough, in Gyarados, even though it has a slightly lower pick rate than Charizard, because more people probably have Charizard. So less people are playing Charizard. But then if you look at the Charizard win rate right here, it's almost 50%. But again, what does that tell you? Kind of a whole lot of nothing. I was asking Evocron what he thought was kind of a good threshold for what a reasonable pick rate was where you could get some information on it. I thought, personally, anything under about a 10% pick rate doesn't really give you great info. All the stuff at the top, when you can see high pick rates and high win rates, you get a ton of information from that. Obviously, if a Pokemon is picked all the time and it wins all the time, that's easy. If a Pokemon is rarely picked and it wins, it's good in the right hands, but we really don't know what it would be if the player base was picking it 20% of the time. And then the same thing, if we have a high pick rate and a relatively low win rate, I think we can deduce that that Pokemon actually isn't doing too well in the meta right now. Again, this is updated on a weekly basis, so maybe next week or after a balance patch, it totally changes. But it's really good to know that what you are seeing on this screen doesn't give you as much information as you think. However, there are a few Pokemon that you learn a lot about from looking at this information, so I'm going to break some of that down for you right now, and I think some of it's really interesting. While talking through this with Evocron, he was able to break this down into a few categories. We have high accuracy, high win rate, so we know a lot about this Pokemon in the meta and it's doing really well. We have high accuracy, low win rate, so this thing is played a lot, but it's actually not performing as well as maybe some people think. We have low accuracy, high win rate. What these are essentially one-trick Pokemon. Your Dodrios, your Garchomps, how well these Pokemon are doing. Then we have low accuracy, low win rate. There aren't a ton of games on them, but we can see that they're not performing super well in those games. And then we have other Pokemon that are just completely inconclusive because we simply don't have a lot of games on them. And I think if we start to think about Unite API in this way, it will be a little more helpful because it's simply not gospel without enough information. Oh, also I should mention before we start breaking down some of these Pokemon right here, depending on what rank you are and the situations you're running into, you can have a totally different experience inside the games than what you're seeing in the top 10,000. We actually don't know how this is broken up between solo, duo, trio, and 5 stacks. I think most often the top 10,000 players are playing in some coordinated fashion, either duos, trios, or 5 stacks. Obviously, there are a lot of solo queue players in the top 10,000 as well, but I think it's mostly dominated by people who are playing with some form of coordination, which does change this a little bit, because what you get in your solo queue game and what works for you in solo queue is going to be a little different, or even a lot different, than what works in a 5-stack game. So let's start with some Pokemon that we really don't have enough data on to say much about. These are the inconclusive Pokemon. Their pick rate is so low, it's really impossible to say if they're good or bad inside the meta. Tyranitar, Zarina, Urshifu, Machamp, Duraludon, Sableye, Lapras, and Greedent. No one is playing these Pokemon right now. I could give you my takes on them, which is a lot of them are actually pretty good, but in general, there's not enough information to say whether they're good or not, and their win rates are essentially completely irrelevant. Now let's talk about some Pokemon that we have a ton of data on and are winning a lot. And you're seeing these Pokemon a ton, and it's because the community, even without breaking this down fully, is pretty aware of what's performing pretty well. Clefable obviously is doing a great job, high pick rate, high win rate. Blastoise killing it right now. Sylveon doing very, very well. Glaceon doing very, very well. Dragapult obviously is crushing it right now. Eldegoss doing very well as a supporter. Crustle, an amazing tank. Inteleon still crushing it inside the game. Now the build is switched over to Snipe Shot. Trevenant, a surprise one kind of, right? I love Trevenant. I think it's one of the best defenders in the game, but it's actually also performing that well. And then Gardevoir doing very well, which doesn't surprise me given its amazing Unite move. And a couple that I think are surprising. We actually have a decent amount of games on Absol and Lucario, and both of them have a solid win rate. So the trend in this group, as identified by Evo, is impactful AoE unites, self-sufficiency, relatively easy to play Pokemon with strong early games, and then Absol being the outlier right here. Absol I think is doing very well. I do have an Absol video pretty recently on my channel, so if you want to check that out, I think it's a good way to look at why this Pokemon is doing so well. These are all Pokemon that are doing well and being picked a lot. That's great data. You know for sure this is working inside the meta. Now let's talk about some Pokemon that are being picked a lot but aren't actually crushing it, and a few will shock you. One shocked me to my very core. I barely have a core left. That's how shocked it is. Again, these Pokemon picked a good amount, but not winning a ton. Slowbro as a tank, not winning a ton on ladder right now. Zoroark not winning a ton, but interestingly enough, different regions really prioritize Zoroark. We see it far more often in some of the Eastern servers than we do in NA or EU. Buzzwole actually not crushing it right now. I'm surprised, and my take on it is that's definitely a skill issue. I think Buzzwole is one of the best Pokemon in the game, hands down, but it's getting picked a lot and not winning a ton. Mimikyu, another Pokemon with a high pick rate and not a stellar win rate. Umbreon also. I think the really big deal with Umbreon is that it's a tank and it doesn't always carry super hard. Most players are picking mean look on this Pokemon, and it's just showing that your allies are not capitalizing on a lot of these moments. We also have Decidueye, Greninja, Cinderace, Venusaur, and Pikachu. All these Pokemon picked a decent amount, but none of them are crushing it win rate wise. So if you want to take some accurate data from the data, it would be on Pokemon like this. Evocron says the trend with a lot of these Pokemon is that they are reliant on their allies more than some others. They're generally squishy and highly susceptible to crowd control. And we know that's true, you know, for something like Greninja, you see those amazing Greninja players, but Greninja takes a ton of skill. And you also see a ton of players who really just can't keep up with a Pokemon like Greninja. Now let's talk about some Pokemon that we have some data on and aren't winning a ton. So these are our low accuracy, low win rate Pokemon. They don't seem to be crushing it, but they're not played an insane amount. Charizard, Azumarill, Snorlax, Delphox, Meowscarada, Zeraora, Ninetales, Leafeon, Talonflame. Are you seeing the speedsters in here? Aegislash, Goodra, Scizor, Gengar, Gyarados, and Comfey. A lot of speedsters end up in this category, and one of the biggest reasons is because speedsters are the most difficult class to play, the most difficult class to get value out of, and it takes someone who's very good with a speedster to actually be able to win a lot of games with it. You're also seeing some other interesting trends in this category, like something like Snorlax is really team reliant. It's a great Pokemon, but you need players around you to understand how to use it. Evocron broke this category down by saying a ton of speedsters are here, which makes a lot of sense. People are bad at speedsters. Pokemon also have some weak laning in here. Zard, Delphox, Gyarados, not incredible in lane. Snorlax is likely down here because it's very ally dependent with its heavy slam build, and otherwise worthless as a defender with flail. Ninetales being down here is likely due to it not converting well into late game due to its range. And now here are some Pokemon that we don't have a ton of data on, so this is low accuracy, but they have high win rates, and this is sort of in the one trick category, right? This is where players are really good with this Pokemon. They pick it all the time, and even though as a community we're not picking it a lot, when you do see a good player on it, they are winning games. These Pokemon are Dodrio, hey buddy, Garchomp, Dragonite, Mew, Mr. Mime, Cramorant, Hoopa, Blaziken, Blissey, Mamoswine, Wigglytuff, and Chandelure. Evocron breaks down this group of Pokemon saying that they all have high skill floors, meaning these are all Pokemon that you have to have a pretty high level of competence on to even start doing well with, and players are unfamiliar with their kits, so it's easy to punish enemy players who don't really know how to fight against this Pokemon because you don't see it a ton, and if you're really good with it, you can absolutely dance around them. You know, I'm thinking about something like Mew here. When you see a great one-trick Mew player, it's a thing of beauty. I mean, they're so difficult to deal with, especially for someone who is not as experienced. And then he points out that Blissey being in here is just, you know, essentially Blissey does well if the allies it's paired with is doing well. And then of course Hoopa is really based around whether or not you can get some good hyperspace hole action going on. Some players and teams take advantage of it more than others. But there you go. That's a look at the meta right now. Again, just a slice of what's going on this week and what this information actually tells you. So next time you look at a Pokemon here like Urshifu and you say, well, the Rapid Strike build for Urshifu is terrible, just remember that almost no one's playing this Pokemon in general, and when they do, almost no one is playing this build. Is this build bad? I played it a few times. I think it kind of is. But we don't have a lot of information on it. So when you look at this site, I think you get so much good info. I also think some of the things that you look at could mislead you a little bit. Let me know in the comments what you think. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it helped you out a little bit because there's so much great info here, and there are also a few things that I think could lead you astray. All right, I love you. I'll see y'all next time. Thank you, Evo.